Greetings, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live, the virtual extension of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight, City Lights, in conjunction with San Francisco Bay Chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility, are pleased to present Lindsey Dillon discussing her new book, Toxic City, Redevelopment and Environmental Justice in San Francisco. It is published by the University of California Press. It is an important and timely work which reveals a lesser known and neglected history of social and ecological injustice surrounding the Bayview-Hunters Point community here in San Francisco. The work explores the environmental vulnerability of the neighborhood and its residents and their hard-fought, decades-long battle for toxic cleanup and self-determination. Before we begin, as is customary before each event, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people. I would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who came before us as stewards of the land. The Bayview-Hunters Point neighborhood has for decades been the site of an ongoing battle. In Toxic City, Lindsey Dillon presents a pointed critique of post-industrial green gentrification. As cities across the country clean up and transform contaminated waterfronts, abandoned factories, turning them into exclusive spaces of urban nature and green living, working class residents who previously lived with serious effects of industrial pollution, state abandonment, and corporate divestment are threatened with displacement at the very moment these neighborhoods become gentrified. Toxic City details how residents of Bayview-Hunters Point have fought for toxic cleanup and urban redevelopment, and how their efforts are linked to long-standing struggles for Black community control and self-determination. She argues that environmental racism is part of a long history of harm linked to slavery and its afterlives, and concludes that environmental justice can be conceived within a larger project of reparations. Lindsey Dillon is a critical human geographer and assistant professor of sociology at the University of California at Santa Cruz. We have a special guest who will be joining her tonight. We are honored to have with us Karen Pierce with Bayview-Hunters Point Community Advocates, an organization established in 1994 as a grassroots community governed and operated by long-term members of the Bayview-Hunters Point neighborhood in San Francisco. Their programs combine community organizing with education, advocacy, and direct services. They seek to build the neighborhood's capacity as a self-determining, fully autonomous force for social change in today's San Francisco. So we're going to be posting links in the chat with which you may learn more about their good work. I'd also like to take a moment to say a few words about our co-sponsors of tonight's event. San Francisco Bay Physicians for Social Responsibility was founded in 1979 as a nonprofit education and advocacy organization that combines the power of community activism with the knowledge and credibility of health professionals to promote public policies that support human and environmental health. Their work is anchored in their central concern for racial, social, and environmental justice. We have also posted links to their website so you can learn more about their good work as well. It's always a pleasure to be working with them. So we're going to be hosting a Q&A towards the end of tonight's discussion, so please feel free to use the chat to post your questions and comments. Also, I suggest that everyone switch to speaker view so you kind of get a clean view of the speakers, and also it kind of eliminates that Hollywood's square kind of effect. So join us now in offering a warm greeting to Lindsey Dillon. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much, Peter. That's a very generous and joyful welcome. So I want to thank Peter and City Lights Live for the interest in this book, for Julie and Physicians for Social Responsibility for their interest as well. And a real particular thank you to Karen Pierce, a longtime activist. And I know, as Peter mentioned, one of her many roles is as founder of Bayview-Hunters Point, or one of the founders of Bayview-Hunters Point Community Advocates. Karen is one of the key persons to listen to in understanding what environmental justice means or ought to look like in Bayview-Hunters Point and San Francisco in general. So I'm very grateful for her being here this evening. As I said to Peter when he first invited me to this book series, I would prefer that this event focus on the issues rather than kind of being a standard book talk. So I really hope that that's what we can do tonight. By way of getting there, I'm just going to explain a little bit about how I came to write this book and introduce just some of its concerns or arguments. And then after I speak, Karen will say a few words, and then we can open it to discussion. And as a side note, because this is a City Lights event, I'm assuming a general familiarity with San Francisco in this room, but we can kind of also take a step back and talk about, the geography of San Francisco, where Bayview-Hunters Point is in the Q&A. So my introduction to Bayview-Hunters Point, and I'm going to try and keep my notes a little bit short. I'm going to go in between some notes that I wrote down on paper and reading a little bit from the book. But as I said, I really want to create more space for Karen to talk and for discussion. So my introduction to Bayview-Hunters Point was actually 20 years ago when I volunteered at a garden in the older Double Rock housing project, which has since been actually torn down and redeveloped. And I worked there on Saturday mornings for a couple months, helping a group called Hunters Point Family get this garden back up and running again. And to just set the scene, I'm going to read a paragraph from the introduction. So in getting to the garden, I drove with a few volunteers down 3rd Street before turning left, past warehouses and down a quiet road into the housing project. It was a bumpy drive. Much of 3rd Street was then a dusty, unpaved construction zone, as the city was in the process of building the 3rd Street rail line, which now connects from downtown, actually from Chinatown now, through Hunters Point. At this moment, the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency had declared much of Bayview-Hunters Point a project area, and this official designation was really being contested and raising for some concerns around gentrification and displacement, conjuring for some memories of the Fillmore and urban renewal and displacement there in the 1960s. I could, in a literal sense, feel the unevenness of redevelopment as the car jostled along the road. It was unclear at that time how redevelopment would improve the lives of people living in the dilapidated Double Rock housing units, some of which faced the garden. And I felt like I could sense this uncertainty in the air that swirled along with the construction dust unearthed from the bowels of 3rd Street. And when I was working at the garden, I learned about the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard and some of its history and the city's plans to clean up and redevelop it. So what I'm describing in this passage is what felt like what I learned later, and what felt like a real transitional moment in the neighborhood in which urban development could go in a number of directions. So at the time, this was 2004, 2005, residents like Ms. Pierce were organizing fighting to close this notorious power plant in Hunters Point, and it eventually shut down in 2006. So there were these environmental justice wins that I think Karen can speak a bit more to. At the same time, there was this emerging political will from City Hall to clean up and redevelop parts of this neighborhood where people had for over a century lived with the worst of San Francisco's industrial economy, as well as the toxic legacies of war at the Hunters Point shipyard. And just a small note, in case anyone has seen Oppenheimer, we were talking prior to the event starting about the connections between the shipyard and the atomic bomb. And some of the radioactive waste, at least that's on the shipyard today, is the legacies of nuclear testing in the Pacific Ocean. And so a lot of that debris was brought back to Hunters Point, and there's a radiation lab there. So these are the material circumstances that people are grappling with today. It's like, what do you do with this? What does cleanup look like? Who gets to decide? So these questions of like, would cleanup and redevelopment, which represented opportunities for a kind of justice, would these benefit longtime residents, or would they lead to kind of displacement? And I think of displacement here as both, physical, but also kind of cultural displacement of the neighborhood's longtime Black community. And I saw these as questions of environmental justice. So who is cleanup for? And to some extent, they're really at the heart of this book. So a few years after my experience in the garden, I went to graduate school across the Bay. And so the book emerges from research that I've done over many years. But I just want to say it took me a really long time to figure out how to write a book that felt adequate to the complexity of issues unfolding in the neighborhood. And I'm not quite sure it does it justice, but to say it tries to capture that complexity. It was also a struggle to keep up to date with what's going on in the shipyard. There's still constant headlines of new radioactive objects found. And so the book is kind of a snapshot, or like represents an analysis, like I say, of a really ongoing story. I also took seriously what it meant for me as a white woman and an outsider to the neighborhood to study this place and these topics. And so these were like ethical questions to me about what the book ought to look like, whose analysis it should center, and who I was like accountable to in writing it. And I'll just read just a little bit from the intro. So the book looks at the politics of environmental cleanup and urban redevelopment in Bayview-Hunters Point. The ways the neighborhood was produced through histories of industrialization, militarization, and state abandonment, but also through the everyday and extraordinary work of neighborhood organizers and residents to make the neighborhood a better place to live. Today, the historically Black neighborhood is in the pathway of gentrifying redevelopment that extends, from the financial district southward to Hunters Point along the waterfront. I say large-scale cleanup and redevelopment in Bayview-Hunters Point ought to be a socially, economically, and ecologically reparative process. Instead, what I found is that cleanup and redevelopment are complicated and uneven in their social benefits, and have contributed to new forms of dispossession, marginality, and environmental harm. And one of the things that really came up, and it took me a while to recognize it, was how in this moment of cleanup and redevelopment, one of the things that people have been really concerned about for almost a decade is the dust of demolition, of large-scale redevelopment, and how this contributes to toxic air quality for people already kind of grappling with racialized health disparities around asthma. And so there's a way in which cleanup and redevelopment can actually produce harms if that issue isn't addressed. However, I also write that residents have not just been impacted by these dynamics. In the 9 years I spent volunteering with organizations, attending meetings and events, interviewing people, and reading through archives, I saw the myriad ways residents critiqued and resisted exclusionary urban development and environmental injustice and organized around alternative visions of environmental repair. Their critiques, demands, organizing strategies, and everyday practices over many decades have made the neighborhood a better place to live, work, care, and play. So what I've tried to do in this book is both identify these larger social and historical forces that have produced Bayview-Hunters Point as a site of environmental injustice. Many have argued, or the term environmental racism is often used. But also, more importantly, what the book tries to do is to center the activism, visions, and analysis of residents as they both resisted environmental harms and worked to build a more just city. And so this last point is particularly important to me, that I wanted to emphasize that neighborhood activism is not just a form of resistance to injustice, but that activists were and are putting forth a vision of what a more just city could look like. And so there's I sort of, because that point really matters to me, I wanted to kind of take us back historically. The second chapter of my book is called Black Counter Planning for a New Hunters Point. And it looks at neighborhood activism for the 1960s. So I'm going to do a detour towards the past because I think it tells us a lot about the present and what justice might look like. So some context. In the early to mid 1960s, thousands of Hunters Point residents, and mostly Black residents by this time, were living in poorly built military housing on and around Hunters Point Hill. So this was housing that was never intended to last. It was built solely for workers during World War II at the Hunters Point shipyard, and by design, it was supposed to be demolished after the war. And yet, 2 decades later, people were still living there. Public housing in general in Hunters Point was in violation of dozens of municipal health codes, and Black men were routinely harassed and killed by San Francisco police. At the same time, in the 60s, a large urban renewal project in San Francisco's Fillmore district was tearing apart the center of Black culture and political life in the city. So in chapter 2, I examined some of the ways Black Hunters Point residents worked to make space for Black life in the San Francisco in the 1960s and 70s. Confronted with untenable living conditions, residents pursued what I call counter-planning practices. And here I'm thinking of planning broadly in the sense that it's not just done by professional paid planners, but that planning is a practice. It can be a grassroots practice that aims to bring desired worlds into being. What I think of as Black counter-planning in Hunters Point both opposed the state violence, the police killings, substandard housing, and the bulldozers and eviction notices that came with urban renewal. Counterplanners sought freedom from oppressive state practices by asserting community control over housing, infrastructure, food, and healthcare. So some of these, and some examples of this that I cover in that chapter are the establishment of a local food co-op so that Black residents could avoid the small grocers in the neighborhood that had refused to hire Black workers, and kind of provide a cooperative food co-op for the community. A rent strike in 1967 against the San Francisco Housing Authority, in which Hunters Point public housing tenants kind of had this vision of a local housing cooperative that they could establish that would replace the housing authority. The Hunters Point Bayview Community Health Service, also set up in 1967, that offered a Black-run alternative to San Francisco General because Southeast residents, by and large, experienced really demeaning treatment by health professionals there. And so this was like an alternative institution that could provide health to Southeast residents. And lastly, the ways that Black residents, and specifically Black women, were able to intervene and shape urban renewal in Hunters Point, at least for a time. So I thought this term counter-planning really described what I was seeing in the archives and what's still going on today, because it emphasizes how people, again, are not just resisting exclusionary forces, but they're actively offering other visions of what the city and an urban life could look like. And this is important to me, and I think it's important when we think about contemporary politics in Hunters Point, because it really shows and emphasizes, and I think a take-home message here is the long tradition of organizing in Bayview-Hunters Point, going back generations. And I think one of the premises of the book is we really need to listen to people there and the work that they've been doing over many, many, many years. So by way of sort of wrapping up my own comments, I wanted to just mention maybe 3 points or concerns that came up for me in the book. I sort of learned through the many years of doing this work. The first is about cleanup, or the technical term for cleanup, toxic cleanup, is remediation. So I'm going to kind of use both of those terms. So remediation or cleanup at the Hunters Point shipyard, again, it's a large toxic military base with radioactive waste, among many other toxic substances, but with a connection with nuclear testing. Remediation at the Hunters Point shipyard, as with other Superfund sites, even in the best of cases, follows this formal legal process by which complex political histories are converted into technical problems, and in which professional experts are the only legitimate problem solvers. What I saw in remediation meetings, through interviews, and through the archives was that for many neighborhood residents, the shipyard was not an abstract space. It was not just a stack of risk assessments, but it was a place filled with memory, politics, entangled in life histories, with family migrations to California, with pride in military service, with economic decline in the neighborhood, and with cancers, with concerns about the relationship between the shipyard and cancers in the family. So it's a complex place. And I think that attending to how residents over decades have articulated the kind of remediation they want and that they think they deserve gets us closer to what a just remediation or a cleanup that centers environmental and economic justice can look like. So I think there's a real lesson here, not just for San Francisco, but for cleanups all over the country. So for example, some of the things I heard is that people, that I learned over this research process, that people have, for example, have insisted and tried very hard to make sure that remediation can provide some stable jobs. And there's this quote that just I always come back to. I was at a meeting, and I heard this guy behind me say, He was just kind of saying it loudly to everyone around him. When I hear Superfund, I know that someone's making a whole lot of money. So there's this awareness that this cleanup process was generating a lot of profits for some people, and a kind of critique that it should be redistributed, that there should be some benefit for the community. People have wanted health studies to understand the epidemiological impacts of working and living near such a toxic site. And they've fought for meaningful community oversight over the process. So those are just some examples. But it tells me that remediation doesn't have to just be a technical process. It can be a reparative process. And we can learn what that could look like by listening to the politics of this in Hunters Point. You know, I had another point, but I think I'll end just with this because Peter mentioned it. So as I was finishing this book, kind of wrapping it up during the pandemic, the California State Reparations Task Force, which had been established in 2020 in response to the murder of George Floyd and the summer uprisings following that. So as I was finishing this book in 2023, the task force published a 1,000-page report. They'd been meeting during the pandemic on Zoom and doing this work. At the same time, the city of San Francisco actually has an African American Reparations Advisory Committee that's going on right now. So these questions about reparations are really complicated conversations, but I think it's relevant that both task forces, the state and the city level task force, as well as the reparations platform put together by the Movement of Black Lives, which you can find online, mention environmental and health harms and disparities as part of what Sadia Hartman calls the afterlives of slavery. So these reparations, or how we might think about reparations in 2024, these reports argue need to address environmental and health justice or injustice as well. People often think about reparations and they criticize reparations as simply a check. But it's important to know that the bulk of the California Reparations Task Force is devoted to specific policy changes. So it's like a platform of things, not just a check, but it's kind of what policy changes do we need to kind of actualize this better world that we want. And I think it's possible to also think about how the cleanup and reuse of hazardous waste sites in historically Black neighborhoods, such as Bayview-Hunters Point, whether it's a power plant or a military base, these offer opportunities to connect up with contemporary reparations platforms as well, and to think about, you know, Karen has worked in the environmental justice movement for decades, so I'm curious what she thinks about this, but to think about something like a reparative environmental justice, and how repair is part of building a better future. But to get to that better future, we need to address historical injustices and think about what repair can look like. So I'm going to end there and pass this over to Karen for any of her comments on her experience doing this work for many years.
So thank you, Lindsey, and thank you to City Lights for inviting me. I am honored to be here. I'm going to get right into what I found was really the heart of the discussion in your book. And that is that in our fight to clean up the neighborhood, we, the advocates, the community activists, the everyday folks that come out to meetings now and then, all have an idea that at some point there is going to be cleanup, okay? I served on the RAB early, and the name of the RAB is Restoration Advisory Board. So when I agreed to be on it, I was thinking restoration. That means cleaning it up, making it whole in my mind. And I think that was in the mind of all the community members that got involved. And we spent years fighting with the Navy because, as you point out, the real purpose of the cleanup is to use risk assessment to determine what's the quickest, cheapest way to actually get the land producing economically again. And it has nothing to do with actual cleanup and restoring the land or the area to something where people feel safe and comfortable. So I had never really thought about it the way you have explained it. And it was like, oh, light bulb. That was one of the reasons why the RAB meetings were so contentious, because, you know, community was there looking for restoration on many levels. And what the Navy was doing and the Department of Defense does on all of these sites is look for how they can limit the risk to a point where they can convince developers that it's okay to move on to the land. So, you know, what we have in Bayview is what we have at the Hunters Point shipyard. And I know that it's being renamed to the San Francisco shipyard. But it will always be the Hunters Point shipyard because it is so notorious. You know, it was not the San Francisco shipyard that loaded the bomb onto the ship, that took it to the Enola Gay, that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. It was the Hunters Point shipyard where that occurred. And that can't be erased. And that is of concern. It's concern to me as a person who lives in a neighborhood that was that intimately involved in that destruction, as well as understanding that we really had no understanding. We didn't understand what that bomb was all about. And we really didn't understand what the restoration of the shipyard was all about. And you really cleared that up in my mind for me. The frustration of talking to the Navy and their refusal to understand what the points were that community was making and demanding it got to the point where I finally decided that I would just quit. I'd leave because we were getting nowhere. And a couple of years later, the Navy was able to shut down the RAB, which actually is required by federal law to exist. But when it became too hard to control the discussion, they just got the approval to stop it. And now we have a situation where I went to the meetings for a little while. I don't even go to the meetings anymore, you know? And that's unfortunate. So that brings me to something I want to point out to you. In your discussion around the work done in the 60s around redevelopment and planning, you use a quote from Mrs. Essie Webb. So she was a friend of my parents before I was born, all out there on the shipyard at the time. And I called her Mommy Essie. Okay, but Mommy Essie was probably the driving force and one of the founding members of the Bayview-Hunters Point Community Advocates. So in the 60s, she was fighting for our neighborhood. And in the 80s and 90s, she was leading us to develop another organization to attempt to make life better. And that's the kind of dedication you find in the work we're doing, and it's necessary. We have had some relatively small and some very, very small successes and wins, and we celebrate all of them because the understanding of what community is trying to do is blurred often by the language that's used and the lack of understanding of what community is trying to do through all of this. You know, I am one of the people that I think in many circles is seen as somebody who is just always ready to argue or start a fight. And I do that well, so I take that role seriously. However, the bottom line is we don't have an opportunity to sit down and just be reasonable. As soon as we sit down and start being reasonable in a discussion of things such as the cleanup of the shipyard and how that should include ensuring that people who have lived through all of this also have the opportunity to work on the cleanup is relevant. And, you know, from the Navy's point of view, it wasn't relevant at all. From our point of view, it is a part of environmental justice, the justice of being able to be included in the enormous amount of money that is spent on those cleanups in neighborhoods all over the US. And, you know, right here in Bayview, it's been more than $1 billion spent. And what we have is a contaminated place that no one is sure of exactly what contaminants are out there, because the Navy has made sure that we focus only on the radiological contamination. And there's a place in your book, and I'm gonna I think I flagged it. I think it's, let me see if I can find it. But you give a list of the contaminants that AAA dumped into the soils. Those have not been addressed through this RAB process, and none of us are clear whether or not that was cleaned up. And that was after the contamination from the research lab, and after the Navy stepped away. But it still can be, and we know it is, emitting poisons. So, you know, as we look at needing to have the space cleaned up and restored, rather than fixed up so somebody else can make a bunch of money off of it, we need to keep in mind that we also need to have the opportunity to share in that cleanup. So I got lots of stories about working in Bayview, and I just have one more comment I want to make right now. And this is not in your book, but this is so contemporary. If we look at the plan for responding to sea level rise right now, we have a huge multi-billion-dollar plan to connect the shoreline that is owned by the Port of San Francisco. It only does their shoreline, and there's a lot of focus on building up the shoreline on the northern side of that boundary. And then when you get down here to Bayview-Hunters Point, they're going to use wetlands to help protect the shoreline. I just got a message from someone this afternoon who said, you know, jokingly, yeah, we're out here and we're looking at the Yosemite Slough area, and I'm thinking, oh, wow, what's really going on is the city has designed this so that all the excess water is coming right here in our neighborhood. Yeah. It's ongoing. There's always a new battleground, and we have to see it as a battleground, and we have to find ways to work with the folks who have the authority to be able to change it, and try to figure out how to do that so that we can, in fact, have some impact. And the impact has come periodically. It took us, after an agreement to close a power plant, it still took us 10 years of fighting to get that power plant actually closed. So, you know, I think for me, reading your book, like, as I said, you really were able to help me place some of the confusion in this work. It's like, we think we're going to restore something, but all that's going to happen is that it's going to be repaired enough so that somebody else can come in and, you know, make billions off of it.
So this is a chance to open to questions from the audience, but I want to respond first of all to say, Karen, I'm so happy that you thought I put my finger on something, but like, that is all over the archives that your organization helped get electronically stored at the UCSF. I think it's called the chemical, they have the tobacco archives, and I'm forgetting, it's industry archives, maybe.
Right. I can't think of the name of the archive. It'll come to me.
UCSF, maybe industry archives, and so they have
Right.
all of the documents from the tobacco wars, and a number of other important archives. And so now these are PDFs and people can read the transcripts of these debates from the 90s and 2000s. And that's where I learned. I went to remediation meetings myself, and this was after they were these kind of PowerPoint presentations. The RAB had been dissolved, but I learned. I'm glad I put my finger on something, but that came out of the words of people that I was reading word for word. And so if anyone's ever interested, Bayview-Hunters Point Community Advocates has gotten these records, these transcripts housed online, so anybody can read them, and you can see the contention, the politics, the arguments, the debates, all the arguments people have been making for decades. And I think it's an unfortunate, I just want to say it is the case studying this site, but I think many other cleanup projects, the cleanup is just enough to like legally get development in, and then, you know, because of the way capitalism works today, it's a private company that comes in and, you know, gets profit from developing the formerly toxic site. But it's my belief that this isn't inevitable. It doesn't have to be this way, and that there is a version of cleanup that is restoration, that is a kind of repair. And I think that can look like a lot of things, but I think really listening to what Bayview-Hunters Point residents have been saying for over 2 decades kind of gets us to understand, okay, well, what would a just cleanup look like? And that it's possible.
Yeah, I think you're just so entrenched in trying to get other folks to understand what's going on, that you can't quite characterize it in big picture terms, you know? So it's like, total frustration. And we were saying the same thing, but you pulled it all together for me. It's like, wow, we were fighting that. We kept telling them that that's what they were doing. They just, the Navy, the regulating agencies all just ignored that and kept moving forward in their own plan.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll see what happens. There's been a lot of noise around the current plan for sea level rise that protects the port and stops before it gets all the way down to our shoreline. But there's been enough agitation around it that we may see a project that takes a different approach and we get equal protection. But it's another fight. It's like, it's never ending.
Yeah, and I think, and one of the things I tried to do in the book is sort of detail all of the, you could think of them as micro or mini ways that like the Navy and regulatory agencies like put up all of these barriers. And I think it's really important to name, and I can just say this as more of an observer. Karen, you can say this probably in much more detail, is what, it's just how much work it is to kind of hold agencies to a basic standard of equal enforcement or just like a minimum version of justice. And I can only imagine that it's exhausting and just never ending. And so there are all of these kind of micro ways that people have been dismissed, or Karen, you mentioned trying to be reasonable, the ways that people have been portrayed as irrational or unreasonable, you know. So I think I've tried to like get those kind of details about over time, all of the ways that kind of justice was, or kind of a larger, not even justice, but more an expansive version of restoration was diverted into this very narrow sort of technical project.
Yeah, you did a good job of that, I think. And you know, I think the frustration of community members that are continue to fight so hard to see real changes in the neighborhood. And we just see the same thing over and over again. What's really ironic, there was a time when we would say at some of the meetings, yeah, you're going to leave it the way it is until we all die off. Then you'll have a bunch of people who don't know the history and will move on to this property. And by the time they get sick, you'll be gone, so you don't have to deal with it. Mm-hmm. So that was being a little disingenuous, but it seems more and more that that's exactly what the plan is. You know, I mean, the looking at the sea level rise planning, you just see once again, Bayview-Hunters Point is going to be used as the dumping ground. It's the floodplain for the whole city. You know, it's planned that way. So we'll fight another fight.
So we have some questions coming through. The first two are kind of very close to each other, so I'm going to read them kind of in unison. Julie asks, what is the most current news about the possible cleanup? Last I heard, they proposed a literal cover-up of 2 feet of soil, as if that were to protect anyone living there. And then the next one is related to the previous question. What action is being taken about the private company, Tetra Tech, I think, who failed to do the testing and or cleanup they were supposed to be contracted to do?
Karen, do you want to speak to that?
I can tell you that I don't know what's happening with Tetra Tech, except that a couple of their supervisors or agents did do some months in federal prison. So the whole fraud was proven, and they went to jail. But the EPA did not end any of its contracts with Tetra Tech in the other places where they are. The Department of Defense didn't end any of their contracts. So I don't know what's going on, except that that agency continues to thrive, doing, I assume, the same thing that they have done here, and hopefully not falsifying the findings the way they did with Bayview-Hunters Point. I mean, because we're an active Black community, we are often treated as being very dumb and inarticulate and naive. And so no one expects us to fight back or to bring our own experts in to challenge the findings that they bring forward. And even when we bring in people with lots of letters behind their names, they just get ignored. It's like we're talking to a wall. Nobody's listening. So, if that had been an organization that was either Black or Latina, those contracts would have been canceled.
Mm-hmm.
I say that, and I don't think anyone would really argue with me. But it's done in a neighborhood that has never been a completely Black neighborhood. It's always been a very integrated neighborhood, but it was done in a neighborhood that is seen and referred to by the city as our Black neighborhood. And so they got away with it. And there's no real repercussions to the organization itself.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think it's significant that the company kind of allowed it to all fall on these two people,
Yeah.
as if they were two bad actors, and as if it wasn't. I mean, my interpretation is that this is endemic, probably not just to this company, which is a huge company. And my understanding is that the EPA, it's one of their main contractors. And so kind of severing those intermeshed ties, they've become so intermeshed with the EPA's work that it is hard to separate. But this isn't a story of two bad actors who did some criminal activity. This is a story of a company culture, but also probably an industry that's really motivated by, as Karen said, doing things as quickly as possible and kind of moving on. I mean, I talk about the Hunters Point residents have seen this as a larger process of restoration and repair, whereas for the Navy, this is about risk management and property transfer. And so I think those kinds of logics are some of what people have been up against.
We have another question. Michael says, as an environmental professional, is an environmental profession engaged most often in determining who is or will be responsible for paying for remediation? I look forward to reading the book. I wonder if you could talk more about what your research reveals about how economic development incentives shape the role of state and local governments as they advocate for communities they represent.
So I do tell a little bit of a history of the Superfund Act and how it started and how it changed. And And what I would say is that one of the things that happened across the country at this time, so the Superfund Act, which regulates the cleanup at the military base, was passed in 1980. So basically the end of President Carter's administration, right before Ronald Reagan became president. And when Reagan became president, he gutted the EPA, and it really disabled the Superfund Act. But what happened in the 80s as well, at the kind of global but also national political economy, was a shift where the federal government funded cities less. And cities across the country had to turn to private capital more to fund social projects like redevelopment and cleanup. And so this is part of what makes cities so dependent on private companies. So remediation companies, but also development companies, and helping to get sites cleaned up because there's so much less federal money. In fact, the 1995 Congress, this is Newt Gingrich, got rid of the Superfund that had funded Superfund itself. So there's so much less money going to these cleanup projects, and it makes the whole process really dependent on market forces. And so market forces dictate that, what market forces want is that cleanup get just clean enough that it meets the minimum legal standard. And so, what is going to attract people to a site like Hunters Point is that profit. And in a place like San Francisco with rising real estate interests, what happens is like a company like Lennar, which is redeveloping the shipyard, can kind of get development rights for really cheap and make this huge profit because of, San Francisco real estate. And so I think it's unfortunate that Superfund and brownfield cleanups are so dependent on market interests to even make them possible. So I also look at kind of the shift in remediation standards to risk-based remediation that ties what cleanup looks like to future redevelopment plans. So like I say, if you redevelop a site to a recreational zone or a park, you don't have to clean it up as much, basically, because people aren't technically living there, and risk exposure levels are a lot different. So when a former contaminated site is a park, it's probably pretty contaminated underground because it only has to meet this low risk level. So I think there's some interesting shifts in kind of the political economy and environmental policy and in the science of remediation that makes it really hard to get outside of market interests when we're talking about cleaning up a site. Yeah, but I think the function of a restoration and advisory board is really important. And as I say in the book, I don't think this was ever this space was always constrained, but at least it provided people an opportunity to make their case. And what I think is beautiful about the work of Bayview-Hunters Point community advocates is in getting these documents online and digitized is that's a public record. The arguments people having, the points that they were making, even if they weren't listened to, that's a public record, and that's something we can return to. Yeah.
And I just want to say, I have to give credit where credit is due. My daughter, Michelle, who is now the executive director of the Bayview-Hunters Point Community Advocates, put a lot of effort into tracking down those transcripts and negotiated getting them digitized and made available. So we knew they were there, but they had disappeared, and she tracked them down. So it's yes.
Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour. I'm not sure we'll be able to take all the questions that are coming through, but I actually had a question of my own, and for our friends and colleagues and activists who are across the country who may be experiencing their own battles. Lindsey, you as a researcher, and Karen, you as being an activist in the trenches, what were the lessons that the two of you learned, and what would you offer people who are really maybe even at the beginning of their struggles. What do you wish you had known, like early on?
Erin, you should go first.
I'm going to say, well, one thing I wish with all of the rhetoric and hard work, I wish I had earlier on had a better understanding of what was happening on the shipyard, for one, because it's just, it's the really gross issue. It's big. People understand how big it is. And you say radiation and everybody gets it, you know. But we have so many other places in the neighborhood that are contaminated and that don't get the attention. And fortunately, we have an EPA grant right now that we will be using to develop more active community members and giving them the tools to become effective advocates on their own. And we are focusing on those places that we know are contaminated. We know the regulators know are contaminated, and nobody's doing anything about it. So right now we're also, we have a contract with the Air District, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, to develop the community's plan for reducing emissions in the neighborhood. And we are working hard to get them to focus on the areas. I made reference to Yosemite Slough, which is very contaminated with we don't know what. We have a lot of good ideas about what, because we know what's been going on out there. But we have an incredible map in our office that the Air District provided for us. And it shows the places on the southeast side of the city, the places where there are permits to allow for emissions to occur. And the permits require that the air be cleaned. Okay. And if you look at that map, you see all these spaces that are on the northern side of the city and down on the southern side of this map, where Yosemite Slough is, where I live, and most of the people that are referenced in the book lived or still live. There's almost no regulation. That's by design. That's not somehow an oversight. That is by design. We are the community that is the garbage dump for the city. And as long as they can get away with it, they will continue to get away with it. And that's why we need to build more strong voices to be able to get the city to clean up our neighborhood and clean up their act.
So many answers to this question, and we're headed towards ending this event.
Right.
One of the things that I think I knew this in theory, but I just came to appreciate it so deeply through the details, is that community has so much knowledge. Communities like Bayview-Hunters Point, people there in many different ways, in many different forms, have so much knowledge, and they really need to be listened to. But I also feel like, you know, the history, the archives told me that people had so much and they had so much vision. And I think just listening to current and historical voices and listening, appreciating the work that people have done in Bayview-Hunters Point and places like it over many years is so important. And I think what happens with these kinds of movements is that they get lost in the archives. You find traces of the conversations. Hopefully you get oral histories you hear through interviews. We reference these transcripts. You can see in-depth, detailed debates in the archives now. But if that hadn't been archived, if that hadn't been transcribed, those debates would be lost, and they're so important. So we often find traces of this activism in the archives, but it's there. And I think what we have is groups like communities fighting for these grants to do their work, but they're in the context of a politics of scarcity, where you have Jeff Bezos going to the moon and Elon Musk spending money on who knows what. I mean, and US wars sending all kinds of money all over the world. So that's going on, where you have community groups with really knowledgeable residents fighting for these scarce, limited grants. And so I think that larger context is also really important. It's not just that people have money, but it's deeply underfunded. And so for me, this is a question of redistribution and broader priorities. So like, people should have the necessary resources to make their visions known and to realize them. And that's there. We just have to kind of rethink where all this money is going. That's my answer.
Yes.
You know, and it's interesting you should bring that up, because one of the questions in the chat was has there been any collaboration with the newer and likely more economically advantaged residents of new housing? Could that help draw attention and resources to meet the long-term residents' goals?
Well, there are lawsuits currently. I mean, there's a web of lawsuits that include newer residents, and I know they're concerned about their health, but they're also concerned about their property values on the Hunters Point shipyard. So there's coalitions there that are possible, but I also think, some people like Karen are thinking about these longer term kind of issues, and then I think you have kind of newer residents who are justifiably really upset, but they're also thinking about how the house that they bought is potentially not worth that much.
Exactly, and yeah, it's been manifest mostly in lawsuits. And unfortunately, that's an individual resolution, but it doesn't help us move the folks with the power and authority to making things right. Yeah. Eventually, I hate to put it this way, but eventually they and their kids will get sick. And we've seen some of that in the neighborhood. And they then will realize that they need to be involved on a different level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, on behalf of City Lights, I really would like to thank both of you for joining us tonight. Lindsey Dillon, thanks for producing this very important work and timely work. I'd also like to thank you, Karen Pierce. I mean, it's been a great honor to have you with us and for you taking the time to be with us tonight. Also want to thank Julie Lindo of SF Bay PSR for all her efforts in making tonight happen, and to everybody at SF Bay PSR and for the good work that they do. Always a pleasure to be working with them. So I have posted links with which you may purchase copies of Toxic City. Better yet, come on down to City Lights, browse our stacks. You may buy one directly from us, and we're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district. We're open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. I have posted links for both PSR and for Karen's organization, so please do check them out and their good work. Also want to thank all of you tonight for joining us. You help complete the circle as always. Tonight's program has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and critical thinkers. So goodbye, everyone. Take care. Keep up the good fight, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Yeah. Thank you all. Wish we were in person.
Yeah, I do too.